Hello! Today we'll be talking about sketching a new way of formulating an argument from causal finitism. I'm not going to get deep into the causal finitism debate, but here's a refresher. Let's think about the chain of cause and effect spanning all of reality. If it has a starting point, then that means there was a first cause, a thing which was uncaused yet causing all else. That sounds kinda like God. But if the chain of cause and effect in the world goes back infinitely, then there would be no first cause. So if these can show that there are problems with infinite chains of cause and effect, then that would imply that there is a godlike first cause. So these came up with, dun dun dun, the Grim Reaper paradox. This is a scenario that includes within it infinite chains of cause and effect that yields a logical contradiction. And the theist will say that this paradox causes a problem for infinite causal chains. But then the causal infinitist will say, look, here's another scenario. Once upon a time, Alice was taller than Bob, and Bob was taller than Alice. The end. Now, this is a scenario that includes within it height that yields a logical contradiction. But this story doesn't make me think that all height is therefore impossible. So your Grim Reaper paradox doesn't make me think that all infinite causal chains are therefore impossible. This is when the theist brings in some kind of recombination principle. Basically, a recombination principle is a tool for finding out what's possible. If you think thing X is possible and thing Y is possible, then you should think that thing Z is possible. The theist uses a recombination principle to say that if you accept the possibility of any infinite causal chain, plus the possibility of something like Grim Reapers or whatever, then the recombination principle tells you that the Grim Reaper paradox would be possible. But we know that the Grim Reaper paradox is not in fact possible, so you should reject the possibility of any infinite causal chain to begin with. But the causal infinitist, especially naturalists, will say, what? Why would I accept this principle? Because evolution led me to find it intuitive for a completely unrelated reason? That's lousy grounds for making such an incredibly huge philosophical commitment. In fact, why would you theists accept these recombination principles? They can easily cause huge theological problems. So, at this stage, theists are in their philosophy laboratories trying to create a super specific recombination principle that doesn't create theological problems, but still makes infinite causal chains impossible, and that would appeal to theists and atheists alike. And man, if they could do that, that would be great, but threading that needle is going to be super hard. Fortunately, I think there's a really simple alternative to all this recombination principle stuff. So let's get into that. First, I want to draw your attention to logic and probability. These are two very different fields. Logic tells you with absolute certainty if something is true or false, whereas probability only gives, well, a probability of something's truth. However, when it comes to fallible humans, there's going to be some overlap because we can't always see if a statement has a contradiction in it. So we need to assign a probability to whether or not something is indeed contradictory. For example, here's a proposition. 1,377,271 is a prime number. That's just some number that I chose at random. Now, if this statement is true, we can use mathematics to show that saying otherwise is self-contradictory. Likewise, if it's false, then saying it's true is self-contradictory. Now, here's Jim. He didn't look up if this number is prime, and he's no math genius, so he doesn't just immediately see if it's prime or not. So he doesn't know if the proposition in question is true or false. So Jim assigns a probability in between 0 and 100% to that number's being prime. Philosophers call this Jim's credence in the proposition that the number is prime. Credence has to do with how likely a person finds something, rather than how likely it is out there in the real world. Now imagine Jim learns for the first time the math factoid that the bigger a number is, the less likely it is to be prime. Upon learning that, Jim realizes that the number up there is pretty big, so the probability he assigns to the numbers being prime goes down. This all seems like valid reasoning on Jim's part, even though the proposition in question derives its truth or falsehood necessarily from logic. Jim should assign it a mere probability due to his fallibility. The big takeaway I want to take from this scenario is probabilities about whether or not something is contradictory can shift when Jim gets new evidence. In this case, the evidence was learning a general principle regarding numbers. But if all that reasoning is valid here, then it seems we could apply it to other propositions as well. Say someone shares a super complex worldview. There's a chance that this worldview is hiding a contradiction in it somewhere. And if some general principle makes you think that it's more likely that there is indeed such a contradiction lurking somewhere in the shadows of that worldview, the probability you assign to the truth of this worldview should go down. Now, my take on the Grim Reaper paradox is that it actually gives us exactly that, a general principle for evaluating worldviews. Here's the principle. Infinite causal chains easily hide contradictions. Like, if you go looking into the paradoxes put forth in support of causal finitism, you quickly start to see how an infinite chain of cause and effect so often, like over and over again, looks completely harmless, and then BAM! It results in a contradiction. Quick example. Let's imagine a two-dimensional world. In this world, there are black and white points, possibly infinitely many of them. You can move one of them at a time along some path, and if it touches another point while it's moving, it swaps colors with the point it hit. That right there is actually a contradiction, for you could then construct a series of infinitely many points in a finitely long line, alternating black and white, such that the distance between any 2 points is half that of the distance in between the previous 2 points. Then you move a black point towards one end of that chain, and bam, you get a contradiction. The point will both be black and not black. Seemingly innocuous scenarios with infinity, like this one, have contradictions in them all the time. We're just too fallible to see it right away. Now, when surveying the plethora of possible worldviews on the table that at least don't look contradictory, complete with their own theories of causality and whatnot, many of them will include the possibility of infinite causal chains, and many others will only allow for the possibility of finite causal chains. However, all the worldviews which allow for the possibility of infinite causal chains take a hit in their probability due to the general principle derived from all those paradoxes we looked at. And since the probability of those worldviews goes down, the probability of the other worldviews goes up. And since those worldviews are on average more God-friendly, the probability of theism also goes up. That's cool. And I think that's the way we theists should be cashing out causal finitism arguments. We should be looking at what principles these paradoxes tell us, and apply them to the worldviews on offer. I say principles, because I think there's more to be explored. For example, one might be that you want a metaphysical failsafe in your worldview, something that swoops in and annihilates anything that would otherwise have resulted in contradiction before it happens. This would also help theism because such a metaphysical failsafe will probably resemble something godlike. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and support me on Patreon if you enjoyed this content.